Ladies and gentlemen, this session is sponsored by Motor City Casino Hotel. Please welcome Mayor of the City of Detroit, Mike Duggan, and returning to the stage, the Chair of the 2020 Detroit Policy Conference, Dennis Archer, Jr.
Good morning.
Morning.
Got a busy day. You going up to Lansing later?
We're going to go listen to the governor's State of the State speech, and I know she's going to do a great job as a warm-up to her response to the president's State of the Union.
That's a big deal, her being selected.
I'd hate to be on her speechwriting team right now.
Right.
I know how long it takes me to prepare one State of the City speech, but she basically has to do two major speeches in a week. It's going to be interesting.
So it's breaking news. And as an aside, I laugh with my kids because every time they come out of a commercial break on any of the news channels, it's always breaking news.
Right.
So I'm not sure what's breaking anymore. But in this instance, the General Motors announcement is still breaking news because while it got a lot of press, I think that no one has the appreciation, because you did such a good job embargoing the negotiations, about what happened behind the scenes to get there. And if you could give us a little, as Sandy would say, inside baseball in that regard, but also talk about the tone, because I think it's very important. When we look around the country now, coming out of D.C., there's a lot of anti-corporate rhetoric. And I would think that the proper environment and setting the proper tone at the leadership level is important to attracting these businesses.
Well, when General Motors announced in November of 2018 they were closing down the Poletown plant and all that meant to Detroiters, and they hadn't given me any advance notice, I was pretty upset. I was upset for a lot of reasons. First thing is, I'm a huge Mary Barra fan. I ran the Detroit Medical Center coming out of near bankruptcy and had the pressure of 14,000 men and women who worked there taking it through the Great Recession and being responsible. And I understand the pressure she feels for her company, and I watched what she did coming out of bankruptcy. She had that ignition switch scandal that could have taken the company down. She handled it beautifully. And so I feel like one of the great executives I admired just shut the place down. And so I don't normally talk about private conversation, but I don't think she'd mind this. The world exploded on her, and they were closing down plants in Ontario and Lordstown and different places, and there were protests and everything else. I just called her, and in the middle of her chaos, answered the phone, and we talked for a long time. And I just said, Mary, I understand where you're going. And she says, well, look, I got this capacity. The cars aren't selling. I can't keep running a plant that's losing money. It jeopardizes the future of the company. I got a responsibility to the other 50,000 employees. And I said, I understand all that. Here's what I don't understand. You're going to have to make a big bet on the cars of the future. Automated vehicles are coming, electric vehicles are coming, cars of the future. You're going to have to make a major investment somewhere. It's going to be a scary, risky time for General Motors. Why wouldn't you want to do that in the city of Detroit, where you've been headquarters for 100 years, and we're going to be behind you all the way? And isn't there a way to think about this differently? Other people may be protesting because you're not keep making the old gasoline cars. My question is, could you make what they call DHAM the site of the future? And at one point in her career, Mary Barra was actually the plant manager at the Detroit Hamtramck plant. This was not something she was doing lightly. And so over the coming days, we had a number of conversations. Mark Royce, her right hand, who's just a through and through Detroiter, they started to develop this plan. You think about what they're doing. You're talking about a plant that was built for gasoline-powered cars. To do trucks is a huge investment. To convert to all-electric vehicles, it's a $2.2 billion investment. It's building an entirely new plant. And it necessitated, as she said, we could do this depending on how the UAW negotiations go. If we have the capital coming out of this contract, we could potentially do it. And I worked hand in hand with the UAW leadership, who had their other challenges, but the one thing they did really well is the men and women of the UAW in that contract guaranteed this investment, and you saw what GM is doing. The magnitude of the change is breathtaking. They're going to make these Cruise Origins. If you haven't seen the video, go online. But basically, these are vehicles that are going to be self-driving vehicles that will be the cabs of the future. And they're going to start running the service in San Francisco even this year. It's going to be all electric trucks and SUVs. GM absolutely believes the future, and so does Ford, and so does Waymo and a number of others, that will be no gas emissions, no accidents, because you can do this. And I'm just really pleased with the fact that they changed course and they made the investment here. But, you know, had I taken a different tone and gone and protest and attacked and everything else, I don't know that we'd have had the same outcome. But there's great leadership at GM, and I'm just really excited at what they're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting that and exciting that an industry where many think they're the dinosaurs are still investing and developing here, and you've gone to great lengths to ensure that the community benefits that come out of their investment affect all. And we often talk about inclusive development and being inclusive in these opportunities. And a lot of times when we talk about that, we're talking about jobs. But equally as important is a path to ownership and entrepreneurship. And just because it's my neighborhood, I see what's happening now on Livernois.
Yeah.
So now we're going from a big $2 billion industrial investment to small business in the neighborhoods. It's equally as impactful. We, in that neighborhood and others who live in Detroit, are in need of more services. So talk about the redevelopment of Livernois. I think Rufus Bartell is here, who I know you worked with significantly. He's like the mayor of Livernois.
Absolutely. He and his family have been phenomenal. They were there through the downtimes, and I think they're benefiting today. There's
a lot of them. You see, there must be a lot of Bartells.
Bartells have got cheering sections here. But what they did in that area when everybody else was leaving, they stayed and they took on more space. So this is what you got to do as a mayor. We got FCA, we've got Ford, we've got GM with billion-dollar investments and thousands of jobs. But what about the entrepreneur who wants to get started, particularly the African-American entrepreneur from the city of Detroit? Ordinarily, you don't start out as an entrepreneur writing high rent checks in downtown and midtown. And in the neighborhoods, folks don't want to go to downtown and midtown for their services. If you're out in that northwest area where I used to live, you basically go to the suburbs. And so we had this idea. Livernois had an enormously rich tradition as the avenue of fashion.
That's right.
For many years. And over the years, that slipped badly. But we said, what if we brought it back? And so you know the history quite well. About 10 years or so ago, it was probably the highest incidence of pedestrian injuries and deaths. People just zipped through 5 lanes of Livernois, and people trying to cross the street to go between stores kept getting hit. The city went and put a median down the middle of slow traffic. Then it ran over budget, so they left the irrigation out of the budget, and when the city put the median in, all the grass died, and you couldn't make a left turn. Everybody hated the median, the businesses, the people who live there. And so I see what happens on Main Street in Royal Oak. I see what happens on Ann Arbor Trail in Plymouth. I see what happens in Birmingham, downtown Birmingham, and say, why can't we have one of the great commercial strips right here in the city? And so with the Bartells and a lot of other business folks and all the neighbors, we went through a design process. And in the summer 18, we had a meeting of probably 200 people. And I laid out options. And we had a community conversation. It was one of the most powerful things you've seen. I believe greatly in collective wisdom. You and your neighbor may argue over your fence line, but you put a group of people together and talk. The group as a whole will come to the right decision. I said, okay, here's what we got. We got 4 lanes of traffic and a median that everybody hates. We could take out the median and have 5 lanes of traffic. Well, nobody wanted that. You're back to the earlier problem. I said, we could go down to 3 lanes of traffic, and we could take those sidewalks, which are about 10 feet in front of a store, take the sidewalks out to 24 feet, the widest sidewalks anywhere in the city, and create all kinds of outdoor patios and the like. but you're only going to have 3 traffic lanes. It's going to slow down. And the neighbors talk back and forth. Business owners said, I want the wider sidewalks. We had some folks who lived down in the far side of town who said, I just want to speed through to Oakland County. The neighbors really didn't have a lot of sympathy for their position. And so people voted, and more than 80% of the people voted for this design. And we've had the support of Warren Evans and the county on the street lights. And the street lights we're putting in not just light the street, but there's a backlight over the sidewalk, which now extends the shopping hours. And so folks voted for it. Well, of course, this summer with the massive tearing up, people who didn't live anywhere near there came out and protested, what are you doing? But since it's opened, and the Bartels will tell you this, the business is unbelievable. If you haven't been there, go on a Friday or a Saturday night and see the traffic going on Livernois. And this summer, we're trying to speed up the permit process for the outdoor patios, but the last business meeting, we had the Greektown folks come over, because Greektown, of course, has used outdoor patios effectively. When they saw the 24-foot sidewalks, they were like, how do I move in? I mean, in Greektown, you got to walk out into the street to go around their patios. And it's going to be a really exciting thing. But this is what we do. If, as a community, you do it in a respectful way. You go into the neighborhoods, talk to the business owners, talk to the neighbors, and let them talk to each other as a group. And then we put $17 million into that streetscape. I had to take a lot of grief in the short term, but I think when you see what happens, this is the kind of city we're trying to build.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, when people talk about this evolution and the C word, earlier I told them don't use the word comeback because Detroit never went anywhere. You know, Detroit's 139 square miles, and people often reference really the 7.2 square miles of the greater downtown area when they're referencing the things that are happening. And we both know that you really can't say that the city is really on a path until the majority of the citizens throughout the city feel that way. And so this is not just happening on Livernois, right? This is happening on Bagley, on McNichols. I mean,
we just finished the streetscape on Bagley, which is what the business community wanted there in Mexican Town. So I got
Southwest is in the house.
Southwest is here. So you know how beautiful that is going to be. We're doing Grand River right now. We're about halfway through it, but you've got huge investment in the old Redford area across the street from your development on the Myers that's going in. I just had one of these neighborhood meetings 2 or 3 weeks ago on McNichols between Wyoming and Livernois, and it was a fascinating hour-and-a-half debate between the neighbors of what they wanted on the street. But you've got a new And there was kind of some tension between what did the neighbors want and what the businesses wanted. We came out with an overwhelming compromise. We're doing it on Kercheval near Van Dyke. We're doing it on East Warren because people in this city, and you know, as a kid in this city, your neighborhoods had great shopping districts nearby that you could walk to, you could bike to, and the like. They've been covered with plywood for the last 10 years. And so with Motor City Match and some other things, we think we can create a bunch of vibrant commercial districts. And interestingly enough, on Livernois in the last 12 months, 13 new businesses have opened, nearly every one of them black-owned. And so we are rebuilding the way that we should.
So let's switch subjects. You've been talking a lot, and I don't think we can talk enough about the census. As it relates to the funding, I think it's around $13,000 a resident that's on the line. Can you talk about and just reiterate the importance of the census and what we can do as members of the community to help you get this done?
Well, in 2010, of course, the city was going through some turmoil and not much effort was put in. And DTE, which shows me what the utility hookups are every day, thinks the city was probably undercounted by 30,000 people. That probably cost us $300 million in services. Everything from money for school lunch to Medicaid to development programs and the like. And so this year, it has potential to be even a bigger problem because the federal government has cut back the amount of money they're spending on the census. There's not a Detroit office this time. Our office is operating out of Chicago. And I think the current administration is not necessarily trying to count communities like Detroit. I don't think you can reach any other conclusion. At one point, you know, we're pushing to have an immigration question on the ballot, and the U.S. Constitution from its inception said you count, for the 1700s, you count inhabitants, you don't count citizens. So they were doing a number of things to try to discourage this. But Vicky Cavari and the team have been working this very hard. But our representation, our funding for the next decade matters. And so we will be out. We are working closely. The census people they hired are trying to count. They're trying to do the right thing. They haven't even been able to fill their jobs. They're up to $24 an hour. So anybody out here is flexible hours. You could work Saturdays and Sundays. You want a second job and be a census taker. But April 1st is count day, and we are networked into every nonprofit, neighborhood, community group. You're going to be able to go into drugstores, and there will be machines where you can fill out the census on site. But we got to get folks counted. And we got one other thing, and I love the landlords in this town. Our high-rise apartments in Detroit, 60% of the people say they don't live in them. And we all know that's because of car insurance. And the law will kick in July 1st, and we'll start to deal with that. But if the folks who are actually living in these apartments don't register in Detroit, it's going to hurt us for the next 10 years. And the thing that we're emphasizing over and over is, under federal law, the Census Bureau cannot disclose any details of your census application for 70 years. They can't give them to the IRS, they can't give them to ICE, they can't give them to local government, they can't give them to your car insurance company. And so we're saying to everybody, and the apartments, our landlords, we're all hosting meetings to say this, fill it out honestly. And where you sleep at night April 1st, don't be afraid to say, I'm a Detroiter, it'll count for the next 10 years. But this is the kind of education that we have to get done.
I think it's important, in that regard, for those people that may not believe a businessman in a suit or a businesswoman in a suit on a commercial saying we're not going to do that, to try to get surrogates
right,
who these folks will listen to get out and say, seriously, this is the honest truth. You got to get involved. I mean, we can't afford to have a repeat of what happened in 2010.
And the voices have been terrific. Big Sean started off. I Swear Vezzo, who I've gotten familiar with his rap music, is taking it on. If you run into Vezzo, he can actually tell you the details of how the census works and every place he's going. But you're right. In 1980, I was a census taker. I was an undergrad at Michigan, and that was the summer, and I knocked doors in a racially mixed neighborhood in Ann Arbor for the summer. And the minority undercount is very real. People of color are more distrustful of why the government is asking who's in their house and what do they make than Caucasians. That's just the truth, which means that our community has to have that much more effort, but you need trusted voices. And across the city, in a number of the ethnic areas and the like, whether it's the Bangladeshi community, the Latino community, the Yemeni community, it's been absolutely terrific to see everybody come together. So some of my biggest opponents have decided that we're going to get along through April 1st and get counted, and then they go back to attacking me again. But it's good to be working with them for a brief window.
How would you describe, you've led, obviously, the DMC, help with the bus system, help with the schools. Now you're sitting in the mayor's office. How would you describe your leadership style, and what about that style has led you to be successful?
I have a gift for recruiting. I think every place I've been, I've had just a phenomenal team, and so everybody who's been successful running a large business knows that the CEO doesn't actually run the things. You have a team of people that have to make it work, and if you're not metric-driven, you're not working for me. I left the cabinet meeting this morning, and first up was how many dog bites were last month and why haven't they come down faster, and the health department and the animal control people are dealing with it. But if you're the kind of person who's results-driven, you love being in an environment where you can make the community better. And if you're the kind of person who's not results-driven, I never have to fire anybody. They leave because they're just miserable at these accountability meetings. But if you
Wednesday morning.
A Wednesday morning they're from 9, they start at 9, they end at 10, and we don't run a minute over. And the data that you see on the wall, how many mortgages did Detroiters get last month, is something that we measure. It's our responsibility to make sure we can raise home ownership. Of course, we look at how many shootings did we have last week, how many buses made pull out on time, and it has been really interesting. And a fellow presenting this morning runs our ambulance operation. In my first year, he failed to make the 8-minute standard, and I fired him. His successor was so stressed, she quit after 60 days, and he came back and said, if you give me another chance, I'll make it. 5 years later, not only did he make the 8-minute ambulance standard, he came in and showed a plan where we are actually billing the medical providers and getting millions of dollars in return. And so it is interesting. You love watching people grow and people do things that maybe they didn't think they have the ability to do. But I was just so proud to watch this fella stand up, a guy who's a career EMS guy, and talk about the details of Medicare billing and how much money is now coming in to support the service. It's very rewarding.
So, talking about teams, you mentioned something, and I see Warren here sitting in the front. Good morning. You mentioned something in the back that there's 2 times in the last 50 years did we have a Democrat in Lansing and in D.C. Talk about the importance of the upcoming election and what that sort of alignment would mean for the city.
Well, it's something that's exciting for me, and I know it's exciting for the county executive, the prospect. But you think about this, the last 50 years in the state of Michigan, there have only been 2 years there's been a Democratic governor and a Democratic president at the same time. That seems impossible in this state, but it's true. When your father was the mayor, he had either John Engler or the Bushes. Jennifer Granholm had the second Bush. The 2 years was the 2 years of Granholm and 2 years of Obama, 2009, 2010, which in this city was a traumatic time in what was going on. And so you have not had a time in this city in 50 years where a mayor could sit with a Democratic president and a Democratic governor and really be able to lay out what is an urban agenda with Lansing, Washington, and the like lined up. So obviously, I'm campaigning hard for Joe Biden, but if we can get that alignment, the next term as mayor could be an historic time. The ability to accelerate the rebuilding of this city with that kind of alignment. Right now, a lot of good things are happening with Gretchen Whitmer, where she is in Lansing. But if we could have Washington aligned as well, it could be transformational for the city.
So I think also, and I think the audience would agree, that alignment is very important, but equally as important is continuity. And I think that, we've got a pretty good groove going here in Detroit. And there's a mayoral election in 2021. And I'm hoping that your name's going to be on the ballot.
Well, if, I work as long as the people of the city of Detroit want me. And I'll make a decision late this year formally. But, if the people of the city are as much behind me at the end of this year as they are right now, I would see doing this one more time. And but we'll make that assessment at the end of the year.
I think we need some applause, y'all. He's got to be convinced, sounds like. And I spoke earlier in the opening about having a sense that people are falling back in love with Detroit, that are passionate about Detroit again. What do you love about the city, the citizens, the city itself?
So, I was born here, and, in my mind, like many of you, remember what Detroit was like in the 60s and 70s, and it was a place of opportunity for everybody, and you could get a job here, you could buy a house here, and with what happened with manufacturing nationally, with a lot of the racial relationships that drove a lot of investment out of this city, and some management problems that we had on the city side, we lost a lot of that. But the people who stayed, they never lost that grit, that determination, that belief that they love their city. They didn't always like what was about it in their neighborhood, but the people who stayed because they believed in the future. And I just had a fellow backstage who out near Telegraph in 96, who was there 8 years ago, and is talking about the way his neighborhood has come back. And I hear that from folks every day. Now, it isn't all sweetness. If I stop and fill my car with gas when I leave here, I guarantee you what will happen is somebody will come over and hug me, get their picture taken with me, and then ask me, when are you going to cut down the dead tree in front of my house? It's my experience every day. But the thing is, people expect you now in city government to deal with these things. And I have to tell my team who, they came in at a time there were no street lights and the buses weren't running and the ambulances weren't running. And now we're getting beat up because the trash cans are left out for 2 or 3 days. or illegal dumping wasn't picked up right away. I said, this is good. If we were in the suburbs, the people who live there would demand this level of service. The fact that we have Detroiters demanding that level of service isn't something to get discouraged about. It's something to celebrate, and it just means you're going to have to raise your performance.
Right.
And we still have a ways to go, but we aspire to that level of service.
Is there something in the time you've been, or a couple things that, since you've been in office, that you're most proud of in terms of accomplishment?
I don't think anybody 6 years ago would have believed that Detroit would be the manufacturing center for the auto industry in America again. But we started out with Shadcon and Flexengate, and then to Bill Ford and Jim Hackett to make the future of the design of their automatic and electric vehicles at the train station, and then starting with Sergio Marchione and the current leadership at FCA, Mark Stewart building the new FCA plant, and now GM building their cars of the future here. Waymo is installing its self-driving systems. The Google affiliate, they could have gone to Silicon Valley. They're doing it in Detroit because of our expertise. We are rapidly becoming a place that makes things again, but more importantly, we're designing the auto industry of the future. We didn't lose that to Silicon Valley as it looked like we might have. And so reestablishing ourselves there has been huge. And so that is a big part of it. But I think the exodus of this city, when I came in, we were losing 1,000 people a month to the suburbs. That slowed to a trickle, and I think has started to reverse. And the feeling of hope. Nobody's under any illusion how much work we have to do. I think all those things are what motivates me when I get up in the morning.
So let's go back to, so you just went through Waymo, FCA, General Motors with the announcement of these big plants, but talk about the spin-off opportunities, right? Because suppliers are now going to have to locate near the plants. What are the additional economic development benefits of these big announcements?
And this is the thing, and automation certainly has cost a lot of auto jobs, but it's done something else that I don't think a lot of people have realized, which is if you were going to Juarez, Mexico for cheaper labor costs, number one, labor costs have risen in Mexico, but second, when a 1,000-employee plant becomes a 500-employee plant, the wage gap isn't as great, which means we can go compete for those 500 employees. We got transportation savings and the like, and so we can land a Dakota, which is now building on the Kettering High School site, abandoned site on the east side of Detroit, with 400 jobs making the dashboards for the new Chrysler vehicles. Why? Because when FCA put in their plant, they gave me the list of all of the suppliers they were going to use, and they helped us with Dakota. There's a 1 million square foot logistics facility being built by the Maroons in the I-94 corridor right now. And I'm sitting with GM, and they've given me a list of the suppliers, because a whole different set of suppliers to supply an electric engine versus an internal combustion engine.
Right.
And I'm talking to the CEOs of these companies saying, you can put your plants in a lot of places. Let me show you why you want to be in Detroit. And it is enormous. And of course, there's lots more spin-off. There's restaurants, and there's businesses, and there's shops, and somebody's selling them napkins, and somebody's selling them food for the cafeteria. There are all kinds of opportunities that result when you land these big plants, and we're going to land more.
That's great. So we've got about 30 seconds left. Yeah. You are not at all responsible for our school system. I think Dr. Vidi's doing a great job. But what can the audience do to help move our school district forward? And
I tell you, if we could do one thing, and we're starting to work on this right now, some of the older folks here will remember the co-op system, where you could be in high school and work. I got somebody laughed there. Jane. Okay, Jane was a co-op. All right. So, but you could work 10 or 20 hours a week. We have, with the support of the business community, rebuilt the CTE programs at the Detroit Public Schools at Bright Haupt, at Randolph, at Golightly, and now at Southeastern. So we got the carpentry and the culinary arts and a lot of them. And we've gotten $30 million in investments that DPS is running. But when you're 15, 16 years old, you got a lot of pressures in your life and a lot of need for financial pressures. To the extent we could get back to the co-op program, where companies were actually partnering with the schools and hiring these kids at 10 or 20 hours a week during the school year, we could start to create pathways for these young people to start putting money in their pockets right away. And the summer jobs program and Go Detroit Young Talent has been an enormous success. But how much more would it matter if these high school kids could start working even earlier? And so one thing I think you're going to see us start to partner with DPS and reach out on is let's get back to these co-ops. How hard is it to hire a high school kid at 10 or 20 hours a week during the year, have them do something productive for you, but also see what it means to work in a business? And so I'd say that's probably the most important thing.
Amen.
All right.
All right.
Got
Mr.
our
Mayor,
first
thank you.
placement. All right.